welcome to yet another episode of the Yellow Gloves podcast. My name's Chris, and today we're going to break down all things Cage Warriors 181, which took place in Newcastle, two title fights at the top of the card, a heap of prospects, a bunch of really well-matched fights. And before I even get into the fights, this is, for me, potentially the card of the year. I mean, it probably isn't the card of the year, but it's one of the cards of the year. And maybe I'll mull on it, and then we'll probably decide in the end of year awards show what gets card of the year. But I loved Cage Warriors 181, and I loved it from the get go. Just on paper, typically you get these Cage Warriors cards, and you have a bunch of compelling matchups, a bunch of compelling fights. But then, admittedly, you do have fights where you kind of, barring a huge upset, you more or less know how the fight's going to end, or who's going to win at the very least. This card was one of those where there were so many well-matched fights throughout. Even for the youngsters and the big prospects on the card, they had tricky veterans to match up with. And for some of them, it definitely showed. And in the title fight, especially the main event between Keweny Lopes and Harry Hardwick, which we'll get into in just a minute, to have a guy like Lopes come in making his Cage Warriors debut, like insane, right? Like one of the bigger, I guess, prospects. It's hard to call a 30-year-old a prospect, but one of the bigger prospects in MMA in general, right? Keweny Lopes is a pretty recognizable name and someone who people have been clamoring to see on the UFC for a while. So to see him in Cage Warriors making his debut, I mean, it just summed it up, right? Like there was so many well matched fights on this card. And I guess, before we start rattling off all of them, let's dive in like we always do. We'll start with the main event, we'll work our way down. The main event was, of course, as I just mentioned, between Harry Hardwick, the champion at 145 pounds, and Keweny Lopes. Those unaware of Lopes, 11-1-1, huge talent out of Brazil. We last saw him get a brutal knockout win over Wellington Prado in LFA. This, of course, being his Cage Warriors debut. And the record looks great, 11-1-1. It's even scarier when you realize that those 11 wins have all been in a row. He started his career with a draw and a loss, so he's won 11 in a row. Hasn't lost since like 2016. 9 of those 11 wins via finish. This guy was like a serious boogeyman for Cage Warriors to come in here against one of the most popular fighters on the roster, and forget popularity as well, just straight up one of the best guys in Europe. And I think it's about time we recognize that for Harry Hardwick. Hardwick, of course, coming into this 11-3-1. We last saw him, of course, securing the title against Orlando Wilson Prince back in May with those successive body shots. And for Harry Hardwick as well, hadn't lost a fight in 4.5 years. So these were two guys who do not know what defeat tastes like very often. And my word, was it one hell of a fight for as long as it lasted, and a sensational performance of the year contender from Harry Hardwick, who, again, we'll get into the end of year awards show later on in December, but it's gonna be tough to dislodge Harry as fighter of the year. Perhaps Shazad Kadrian could have gotten it if he'd beaten Liam Gittins and he'd gotten the belt based on activity, based on the prize fighter stuff. It might have been Shazad, but again, I'll have to mull on it, and I'm not going to make my decision now. But Harry Hardwick is very much looking like the fighter of the year for me. Round one was electric. Lopes started the way you'd expect him to, firing the most insane hooks at Harry Hardwick's head, just beating up the lead leg of Harry. One thing I love that Lopes was doing, especially in round one, was every time that Harry would try to go the roundhouse to the body, Lopes would just kick his back leg and just throw him off balance. And it happened a few times, and you could see Harry was like shaking it off. And at one point, looked like he landed a bit awkwardly on his knee just from being taken off balance like that and having to base again. But yeah, Lopes looked like a man who'd been shot out of a cannon in that first round, which was to be expected. But the thing is, if you can't put Harry out of there, and Harry's got a ridiculous chin, right? He's as tough as nails, and if you can't put him out, you're then risking, and this is what Lopes risked, and this is what led to his demise in this fight. You risk emptying out the gas tank on a guy who you probably won't finish, and on a guy who is one of the most active cardio bullies, huge pace output on all of his strikes. That's what Harry Hardwick is. Like Harry Hardwick, yes, he can stop people with concussive strikes. Yes, he can submit people. But by and large, what Harry Hardwick is a ridiculous pressure fighter with an insane pace behind his activity. And Keveni Lopez could not keep up with him. I scored the first round to Harry Hardwick. I thought even though Lopez did some good stuff early, Harry's strikes were starting to add up, especially halfway through the first round and towards the end of it. Um, you know, cleaning up on those calf kicks, landing the jab. The jab from Harry was unreal in this fight, just using it as a trigger to set up all his other shots and really keeping Keveni Lopez at bay. I thought it was tremendous. Look, the first fight, the first round, it could have gone either way. I think I was in the minority. I saw a lot of people had scored that first round to Lopez, but I thought Hardwick had taken it. And everything from that point onwards, round two, round three, and round four, was just a complete clinic from Harry Hardwick. Drops Lopez in round two with a check hook. Go watch it back if you don't think it was a knockdown. It looks like, it looked like one of those where, oh, perhaps Lopez lost his footing, but in my humble opinion, it definitely looked like a knockdown to me. I've rewatched the fight since last night because I fucking love Harry's performance. His pace just, we've already spoken about the pace, and I'm going to keep harping on about it because you started to see in round two Harry just absolutely take over with his pace, weaponizing his activity, sneaking onto the back of Lopez as well. With that, it wasn't really a takedown, but one thing that Harry did well, both in the first and second, both in the second and third round, was that whenever Lopez would engage wildly, Hardwick would just kind of duck under and just get to the back. And it was beautiful. In round three, he like ducked under a spinning back fist and managed to get to the back. He beat up Lopez in round two, had the body triangle in. Yes, tried to get the rear naked choke. Lopez, amazing grip fighting. And by the way, I'm making this sound like Lopez after round one just completely fell off a cliff. He didn't. It's just that Hardwick put on a pace that Lopez couldn't match. But Lopez was still competitive in round two. But again, another one that I scored for Harry Hardwick. Lopez was busted up, bleeding all over the canvas from his nose. It was pretty gruesome scene. Round three was all about Harry's jab. Again, like I said, using it as a trigger to set up all his other shots. Lopez still doing a good job in that round, chewing up Hardwick's lead leg. But again, I loved Harry's grappling in round three, especially. Lopez did a great job attacking a knee bar at one point to, you know, secure his position and get back on top. But Harry just managing to rotate through, sweeping, kicking out, getting back to his feet. I just thought he was brilliant. And even when he did wrestle, he just looked so good. Lopez, I think, jumped a gilly at one point. Harry just half guard, passed straight into side control. He just made it look effortless on the ground, made it look effortless on the feet. I tweeted after round three, I said, you feel like Harry's weathered the best of Keveni Lopez, and the remainder of this fight will likely be a formality. Lopez saved by the bell in round three, which he was, and it seems like the finish is coming. And in round four, the finish did indeed come. Hardwick's jab again, just really messing up Lopez. But what I love is that he was kind of chaining this left hook to the body behind the jab, which was nice. Hardwick eventually just starts swarming Lopez against the fence. Referee warns Lopez to move, warns him to defend himself. He's looking out of sorts. He's got his hands down. He just seemed like he was somewhere else. And that's just the concussive damage that Harry Hardwick can deal. And that was enough to get the stoppage for Harry in round four. I tweeted this after the fight. I said the Hardwick bros thrive in chaos. You throw the kitchen sink at them and they'll just keep moving forward and putting on a pace that will eventually break you. What a fucking performance from Harry Hardwick. And then I said he deserves a crack at the UFC after the year he's had. And that's where I want to kind of tackle it next. Look, Harry was sensational, potentially a career best performance. And I feel like I say this after every single Harry Hardwick fight, but he is just leveling up and leveling up. He's 12-3-1 now. It's an absolute travesty to me that George isn't in the UFC. But okay, he had the Dana White Contender Series fight, slipped up there, but still, they should be bringing him back. Harry should be getting a shot. Again, man, we had this rant about George ages ago when he got the Contender Series call up. I don't want to see Harry in the Contender Series. What's the point? What's the point in? Okay, yeah, a lot of people are like, oh, George got fraud checked. He didn't. Like, learn on what an actual fraud check is. He just had a tough fight against a really good opponent, and that shit happens. But from the UFC perspective, it makes no sense to me, right? Like, George and Harry in the UK will blow the roof off any arena, right? They've got great personalities. They're great on the mic. They are tremendous fighters. They're champions in arguably the best European MMA promotion. They're beating people who wouldn't look out of sorts in the UFC. Keweny Lopez, a good example, right? Keweny Lopez would probably slump a lot of UFC guys, and Harry rolled him, right? Like, absolutely rolled him after that first round. So I don't want to see Harry in the Contender Series. You know, a lot of people tweet me sometimes saying, "Oh, this guy should be in Tough. This guy should be in Contender Series." I get that, and we'll get to that because there's someone on this card that definitely, a lot of people think should be in one of those. But for me, you waste no time if you're the UFC. You just put Harry on a card. Next time you're in Europe, or next time someone drops out of a fight on short notice, get Harry Hardwick in, let him do the damn thing. Ridiculous chin, ridiculous pressure fighter, crafty on the ground, crafty on the feet, great on the mic, unique personality. It's a joke to me that these boys are still here, and they really shouldn't be. They're far better than, and this is a Cage Warriors podcast, so I feel like I'm the right person to be saying this, but they're far better than this level, right? They are far better, and again, I don't take it for granted because it allows me to talk about their fights and allows me to watch their fights and follow their careers really closely. But Harry Hardwick, front runner for Fighter of the Year in the yellow gloves for me, an unbelievable performance, and whatever's next for Harry, I'm sure it's going to be massive. You'd hope, you'd really hope that it's the UFC, because I certainly hope it is. We will move on now to the co-main event, which was our first title fight of the night between Mafalda Carmona and Kennedy. Freeman, Carmona 7-2. We've seen her in KSW, moving up a weight class here to make her Cage Warriors debut. Freeman needs no introduction, but if you've been living under a rock, 5-0 as a pro, two fights in Cage Warriors, both won via KO. Ridiculous stopping power at 135 pounds. Daughter of UFC veteran and Cage Warriors veteran Ian Freeman. This fight was really good, and I don't know that it's getting the love it deserves because it's being viewed as an absolute one-sided beatdown from Freeman, which it definitely became, and it was an outstanding performance from Freeman. But this was a really competitive fight for a large chunk of it. Kennedy Freeman, of course, getting her hand raised with the stoppage in between rounds 4 and 5. Freeman was well on her way to a decision win, and the corner of Mafalda Carmona just waving it off, and the fighter not being able to continue. Kennedy Freeman looked outrageously good, and what I love about her performance, and we'll kind of, I guess we'll do a little breakdown of the rounds before we get into that. I scored it 10-9 to Freeman after round one. I had it 19-19 after round two. Let's give some props to Carmona, upper weight class. I thought she did brilliantly, fighting behind her jab. I think it was giving Freeman a little bit of issue in round two and round one. I think the jab was dissuading Freeman from pressing, dissuading her from chaining these combinations. But I think what eventually clicked for Freeman is she realized this girl can't hurt me. And as much as you want to sit on a podcast sometimes, especially like this one where we do try and get into the technical side of fist fighting, sometimes it is really as simple as you can't hurt me, so I'm just going to keep pushing forward and I'm going to put a beating on you because whatever you throw, barring a sledgehammer of a left hand or a right hand and an absolute Hail Mary of a strike, which you probably don't possess, I'm going to destroy you. And this is what it felt like for Kennedy Freeman from round three onwards. And like I mentioned, going into round three, I had it dead even. I thought Freeman did a fantastic job being patient, not overcommitting, not overextending. She knew Carmona was dangerous. She knew Carmona was a nifty counter puncher. I had someone tweet me in between the fight. the in between rounds saying that Freeman can finish this girl whenever she wants, and it certainly looked that way. But what's being lost here is that Carmona is a pretty adept counterpuncher, and you saw it. She clocked Freeman a few times, and I think even if you spoke to Freeman and you asked, I think she'd be quite open about the fact that through the first two rounds, it was pretty competitive. But like I said, eventually you realize, cool, all this person has is the threat of hitting me, but not the threat of really hurting me. I'm just gonna push and I'm gonna press and I'm gonna break them. And round three onwards is the best you've ever seen Kennedy Freeman. She was sensational, landing the calf kicks, battering Carmona with that lead hook that she loves to throw, landing bombs against the cage. Huge uppercut at one point busted the nose of Carmona open. Carmona's face looked like pounded meat. It was pretty crazy to see. Usually we see Freeman just dead people, but this is what it looks like when she faces someone who has a good chin, and Carmona did, someone who absorbs a ton of damage. Kennedy Freeman is a monster of a power striker. This is almost like sacrilegious, right? But I'm gonna just before I say it, I'll preface it. Um, for me, Chris Cyborg's the greatest female fighter of all time, right? And I know it's Amanda Nunes, and I know that objectively it's Nunes. Everything that she's accomplished in the sport, she has the win over Cyborg, blah blah blah. But for me, just seeing the way Cyborg fought and her doing it in so many different promotions, even at the age she's at now, Cyborg is my women's MMA GOAT. But the reason I bring up Cyborg, and I guess I partially bring up Nunes, Kennedy seems to be cut from the same cloth. I'm not saying she's of the same level as those. And the jury's still out, of course, and she's still young in her career. But there's something about her. There's something about the way that she presses forward, almost patiently but recklessly, and that she knows that she can just hurt people. Very, very, very reminiscent of Chris Cyborg. I just think Kennedy Freeman is the real deal, guys. Like I've been saying this for a while, but Mafalda Carmona is a very good fighter. I did some tape study coming into this. She's very good, and she wouldn't look out of place in, for example, the UFC. Carmona, I think she was upper weight class. I thought she looked good until she didn't. And Kennedy Freeman just an absolute battering performance. The minute she decided to step her foot on the gas, she destroyed Carmona on another level. And I tweeted it in between rounds before it got stopped. I said, this is one-way traffic. Freeman is landing whatever she wants, whenever she wants. She's not forcing anything, but the finish is there for her. And we didn't really need it because in between rounds, Carmona's corner just called off the fight. Kennedy Freeman is now the new Cage Warriors women's bantamweight champion. Freeman, for me, is a super hot commodity in women's MMA right now. Look, she's got genuine stopping power at 135 pounds. She's a really good personality, a great interview. She's obviously got an amazing background story with her legendary father, Ian Freeman. I mean, it's cool enough that the promos that Cage Warriors can cut just with that story. Imagine if she was in the UFC. Her father, of course, being such a huge pioneer for UK MMA and for UK MMA in the UFC as well. She's now got gold wrapped around her waist. She's 6-0. It feels like the sky's the limit for Kennedy Freeman. And I think the biggest, amidst all of this, euphoria, I think the biggest sadness is that we didn't see Kennedy Freeman fight for 5 years. She took some time off. Perhaps she felt MMA wasn't really for her anymore. She mentioned in an interview that she'd had some abusive or some toxic people around her, and it stifled her from wanting to compete. And then she went to a UFC London card, and it blew her mind, and she felt like she could beat some of the girls that were competing on that card. And since returning, she's been an absolute force of nature. 3 fights in Cage Warriors, 3 knockouts, or 3 TKOs, I guess, because this one wasn't really a knockout, but it was a stoppage in the end. Kennedy Freeman is an absolute star in the making, and and I wouldn't be surprised if the UFC come calling. What's the appetite for them to build out the 135-pound division? Not a great deal, I don't think. I think if we had a London card on the horizon, there is one in March, so maybe Kennedy Freeman sneaks onto that. potentially, she's probably someone that you'd likely see in Dana White's Contender Series. I think they do like to build up fighters on there, and they do like to kind of tap into their backgrounds and their stories. I think Kennedy Freeman would make quite a nifty one. It's a pretty crappy division, unfortunately. So I don't think the appetite is there to snatch her up right away. But I do think she's a hot commodity, and I do think in the next 12 months we'll probably see her get in a Contender Series fight or get in some sort of UFC adjacent fight. And I really hope she does, because what she did against Mafalda Carmona was super super impressive. We'll move on now and cover off the rest of the card. Theodore Bergeron versus Justin Burlinson. This was an absolute thumping beatdown from Justin Burlinson. Just an unbelievable performance from a guy who, look, hasn't had the best of luck in life recently. Um, Obviously was diagnosed with testicular cancer, has since beaten that, but a horrible thing for any human being to have to go through. um, he had the Dana White's Contender Series fight, of course, fall apart. We hadn't seen him since March 2023. In 2022, he was one half of the Yellow Gloves fight of the year with Reese McKee, where he eventually lost in the title fight there. An absolute legend of a man. And it was the feel good story of the night, seeing Justin Burlinson weather an absolute shellacking in the first round from Berger. And Berger looked amazing in the first round, dealt a bunch of huge concussive strikes, and just couldn't put Burlinson out of there. I mentioned in between round one and round two, I tweeted, I'd love to know what kind of black magic has been imbued into the cranium of Justin Burlinson, because he was absorbing some mad strikes, but he survived round one, and in round two and three, that was some inspired shit from Justin Burlinson. It will go down for me and on my shortlist for performance of the year. Justin Burlinson looked outrageous. Round two, it's a 10-8 round for him after losing the first. He just absolutely smashed away at Bergeron on the ground, landed some crazy strikes, was trying to get the submission, had the rear naked choke in, attacked the Kimura, couldn't get it, but stepping into mount, landing big elbows. Burlinson wanted to put a beating on this man, and he did. And look, for all intents and purposes, Theodore Bergeron, 6-1 coming into this fight, really highly rated prospect in Scandinavia. And man, Burlinson just absolutely destroyed the kid, absolutely destroyed him. I mentioned again, I keep referencing things that I've been writing in my notepad or that I've been tweeting throughout the fights, but Burlinson was fighting like he was stealing this kid's lunch money. He was just putting it on him on another level. In round three, it's more, Burlinson was just shooting out in the open, getting the double leg, passing effortlessly into side control, battering Bergeron from side control, battering him in the mount, attacking the back. It was some inspired shit from Burlinson. Eventually, in round three, attacks the head and arm choke and draws the tap from Bergeron. An absolute beatdown of the highest order, an amazing victory for Justin Burlinson with everything he's been through. Like I said, it was for me the feel good story of the night, and Burlinson improves his record. A real player at 170 pounds, and someone that you wouldn't bat an eyelid if you saw him right in title contention, and he deserved to be. It's such a stacked division at the moment for Cage Warriors. There's so much movement at the top. You've got so many big players. Yanis Bakar, you've got Burlinson, you've got Paterno, you've got Emil Brown, you've got Sean Clancy Jr. Welterweight is an absolute pit right now of the most dangerous guys in Europe. And James Sheehan's just waiting for them to line up, and he's going to try and knock them all down one by one. But it's going to be a tough ask. But for Justin Burlinson, incredible performance, a great feel good story here, an absolute one sided beatdown. Amazing to see him back in the yellow gloves and scoring yet another win on his record. The people's main event was between James Power and Dimitri Gurlin, two guys that are, no strangers to putting on incredible fights, no strangers to dealing an immense amount of damage and violence on their opponents. James Power 7-1, Gurlin 8-2, both coming off wins. Power, having a fight of the year scrap with Kolosinski in his last time out, 2 wins in a row in 2024, trying to make it three in this fight. Gurlin, last time out, submitted Chris Bungard in April, has huge wins in the yellow gloves over Patrizzi and Cullen. For me, this felt like a title eliminator at 155 pounds, and James Power passed that test with flying colours. James Power, roundhouse kick to the body, one of the most lethal tools in the sport right now. You hear him land those, and it's the most thunderous, nastiest sounding thing. He's got just such a good base, and when he lands that shit, it's nasty. And look, Gerlin had good timing on it, did get the takedown in round one off the leg, and being able to attack the rear naked choke. But Power did a good job defending it. I scored the first round to James Power. I thought he landed the better shots. Huge left hand towards the end of the round, elbowing off the clinch. And Power's elbows are, you know, bit of foreshadowing here, but Power's elbows are a bit nasty. And he did a good job doubling up on the jab as well in that first round. Stepping knee, elbow over the top. Definitely secured the round in those last 90 seconds because Gerlin did some good work on the ground, but didn't land enough impactful shots. And I scored the first for James Power. In round two, Power was starting to cook Gerlin up from southpaw. Gerlin getting overwhelmed, managed to secure the takedown early and try to attack the back, but Power getting back to his feet, rattles Gerlin with a few successive head kicks, clinches up to land a knee, lands it beautifully, a couple of them. Gerlin shoots out of desperation, Power stuffs it, and then Power deals the absolute final nail in the coffin. Left kick to the body, opens up Gerlin, knees up the middle, and then a huge, what I call fuck off elbow, slumps Gerlin. Just a vicious, visceral knockout of the year contender, finish of the year contender for me. A violent finish from one of the premium dealers of violence on the roster, that being James Power. For me, just the absolute truth at 155 pounds. Again, one of the finishes of the year. And you think about it, he's got a finish of the year contender and a fight of the year contender in 2024. He's won 3 fights. For me, next in line for the title, he should 100% be fighting. I would love to see him versus George Hardwick. I think that would be a tremendous, tremendous fight to make. There's obviously a few players at 155, but none as active as Power and few as exciting as Power. I think he definitely deserves in 2025, if George is still kicking about, even if he isn't, and eventually he moves to the UFC and vacates his belt. James Power, however which way it shakes out, James Power has to be one half of whatever title fight they put on. Shifting back to the welterweight division, we had Sean Clancy Jr. versus Andre Augusto. A really interesting fight because it was put together a few days before the event, and it sounded like Sean Clancy Jr. has been in camp. He's been waiting for an opponent, hasn't had one, but has stayed fit, has stayed healthy, and Cage Warriors managed to pick up Andre Augusto, who returns to the Yellow Gloves after his underdog win over Chris Bungard back in September, 16-7, the most experienced opponent that Sean Clancy Jr. has ever faced, and someone who's only ever been stopped once in his 25 fight career. Sean Clancy Jr. needs an introduction, 5-0. I say it all the time, forget being the best prospect in Scotland, blah, blah, blah. I think he's one of the best prospects in all of Europe at 170 pounds. Fight me, I don't care. He is that guy. And, that 8-1 AMI record as well. All wins via finish as a pro. This being his third fight of the year. He's young, his activity is there, he's dangerous. Sean Clancy Jr. he's that guy, and he looked magnificent against Andre Augusto. Augusto gave him some tough looks, especially with the grappling, especially being able to get Clancy Jr. down. We saw Clancy Jr. in a spot above her on the ground, but he's so active off his back, throwing up triangles, throwing up arm bars. He's got a really techie, nice, skillful guard, and that was causing Augusto some trouble in trying to control Clancy there. I scored the first round for Clancy. I thought he looked excellent in the striking department. Round two again for Clancy Jr. One thing I'll call out, the octopus guard from Clancy Jr. to sweep and try and take the back. I thought that was glorious. But then the coolest part of the fight was the Clancy Jr. gets the butterfly sweep into half guard and then passes into mount, then eventually takes the back of Augusto. That grappling sequence, that sequence of moves, just chaining that all together the way Clancy Jr. did, I thought was just tremendous and shows how adept of a grappler he is because Augusto is no slouch himself. And then, going into the third round, Sean Clancy Jr.'s the first third round of his career as a pro, and you're thinking perhaps he's going to go to a decision and his finishing streak is going to end. Not today, my friends, not today. Sean Clancy Jr. right hook lands, deals this nasty left hook to the body, right to the head, left hook to the body again, and stops Andre Augusto dead in his tracks. 6-0 now for Sean Clancy Jr., who is the absolute business at 170 pounds. All finishes. I'll say it again. Forget being Scotland's best prospect. He's one of the best damn prospects at 170 pounds in all of Europe. This kid is he cannot be stopped. He is absolutely unstoppable at the moment. And usually I like the idea of building these prospects up slowly, but Sean Clancy Jr. looks ready to go. And if you push him too far, and let's say he slips up, he's still so young that he can just claw it back and still make a very good career for himself. Two questions that I had for this pod on Sean Clancy Jr. We'll start with Sean Denny at Denny Rants on Twitter. He says, "Are we doing Sean Clancy Jr. versus Yanis Bakar next, or going straight for Emil Brown?" And NDH330 asks, "Sean Clancy Jr. to Tough. What do you think?" So I'll group those together because it's basically asking about what's next for Sean Clancy Jr. I tweeted this after the fight, and I still feel really strongly about it. I always like to wait a day until I record just to make sure I'm not being a prisoner of the moment. But I think it should be his next fight should be for the title. I'll just put it like that. You do Emil Brown versus James Sheehan, and I think a lot of people are forgetting about this. They're getting caught up on the Yanis Bakar Sheehan fight, which was unfortunately cancelled. I don't think Bakar's going to get that fight back because Emil Brown won the prize fighter tournament, which makes him the number one contender and the next in line for a title shot. You do Emil Brown versus James Sheehan. In the meantime, with Yanis Bakar and Paterno and Burlinson and those guys, they can figure something out. They can fight each other and they can make themselves next in line. But Sean Clancy Jr. should fight the winner of Emil Brown and James Sheehan, and that should be at some point in 2025 in Scotland if they can do it, or up in Newcastle if they can do it, where you can have as many people packing out an arena as Sean Clancy Jr. fans. I think you can strap a rocket to this kid. I think he's going to go all the way in MMA. He's confident, but he's not brash. He's got an amazing skill set, both on the ground and on the feet. And look, we've not really seen him face adversity. I think this is the most we've seen him face in this fight, and it was purely just because the guy was taking him down every so often. Um, we still don't know what it looks like if Sean Clancy Jr. gets seriously cracked. We don't know what it looks like if he has to go 5 rounds, but I'm ready to see it. Is he a bit too early in his career? Maybe at 6-0, but I think at this point, we're just any other matchup for him would be disingenuous. We'd be playing to the same tune. We know what he's going to do. Let's see him in there against the most compelling opponents in the biggest of fights that Cage Warriors can do. You put Sean Clancy Jr. in there. To answer the question about him being on tough, I think that if Sean Clancy Jr.'s next fight is for the title, you can forget about tough if he wins that title. I think that Sean Clancy Jr. should be probably within the next 18 months, will probably be in the UFC. I think he's undeniable. And in all honesty, I can't see anyone beating him at 170 pounds. Perhaps one of the big veteran guys like Paterno, who's in title contention, even Burlinson, like God, those fights would be amazing. But against Emil Brown and against James Sheehan, I think I'd be picking Sean Clancy Jr. in those fights. Like I said, the kid's the business, and whatever they do with him next, I really hope that it's for gold. And if you're listening to this, just stay locked in for Sean Clancy Jr.'s career and be one of the cool people before he gets to the UFC, telling all your mates about this Scottish guy who's destroying everyone and how you heard about him on this random niche podcast. Sean Clancy Jr. is the guy. I can't wait to see how the rest of his career unfolds. Probably the least compelling fight on the card was between Yannick Bahati and Charles Joyner. A really dull fight with a lot of clinching against the fence, a lot of cage wrestling, not really compelling. Joyner was probably on the cusp of a title shot. This fight ending as a split draw. due to a couple of eye pokes and the fight having to end but going to a technical decision. I thought Bahati personally had won the fight, even going into the technical decision. I'd scored it for Bahati. I think he did enough in the grappling department. Just about. The fight was really just an ugly fight. Super competitive, but not in the way you'd hope for it to be. Joyner didn't have his usual pop on his strikes. Bahati did a great job. In all honesty, Joyner didn't have that pop because Bahati was doing a great job closing the distance and forcing Joyner to fight his fight. So, I won't dedicate too much time to this fight because it was really dull. A split draw there. Moving on to the prelims, Daniel Conrad versus Aiden Lee. Conrad, a guy I was telling people, you know, he against James Sheehan in that title fight earlier in the year, he would have beaten a lot of people with that performance. He absolutely put it to James Sheehan, but James Sheehan stayed in it and eventually broke Conrad. It's great to see Conrad back in here. One half of that fight of the year, making his second Cage Warriors appearance, and he absolutely destroyed Aiden Lee in one round. Conrad immediately took Lee down in round one, passed his guard effortlessly into side control, effortlessly passed again into mount, elbowed away at Lee's head. I think Lee did a good job at one point working back to the fence and getting Conrad off, but Conrad just slipping out, attacking the neck, taking Lee down again, clubbing away at his head. He wanted to finish Aiden Lee as quickly and as violently as possible. He wasn't taking him down just to hold him there. It was a ridiculous pace that Conrad put on him, an absolute grappling clinic, took Lee's back and choked him out with 2 minutes or so left on the clock. Daniel Conrad is so good, smooth as hell, improves to 7-2, dangerous and wild on the feet, a calculated killer on the ground. Again, I keep talking about 155 pounds. It's an absolute shark tank in Cage Warriors. Daniel Conrad, I wouldn't be surprised if we see him in a title fight again in the future because he looks so good against Sheehan up at 170 and now he's moved down at 155. He looks good, like body wise, he looked great. Cardio wise, I mean, it was a short fight, but he just looked strong. He looked fantastic at 155 pounds. One of the performances of the night there from Daniel Conrad. Cannot wait to see how they match him up next. Albert Diaz and Bailey Gilbert, perhaps not the most exciting fight, but an absolute dogfight. Bailey Gilbert, someone I scored it. I scored it 28-27 to Gilbert. Of course, Albert Diaz getting 2 points deducted for the illegal knee. It's rare to see, in all fairness, it's rare to see points taken typically in MMA because usually the referees just, even if they see it, they're like, oh, this is a stern warning. But yeah, Diaz gets 2 points deducted, which I don't hate for the illegal knee. You guys know how I feel about it. Legalize the knee, but until they legalize all of it, you got to play by the rule books. And it was the most egregious, obvious illegal knee. I don't know what Diaz was thinking, but that snuck 2 points off the card and allowed Gilbert to sneak in there and get the win on the scorecards. I think Gilbert displayed immense grit, immense toughness to stay in the fight and winning the third round, the only round he won, in my opinion, wins the third round with some big shots against the fence. And look, if not for the point deductions, Diaz probably would have won 29-28. But Gilbert, I think that the biggest takeaway from this is how tough Gilbert is. He just looked awesome in there. Considering some of the damage he had to deal with, considering the fact he took that illegal knee, to fight back, to stay in the fight, and then win the third round and effectively bank that round to win the fight, I think was really impressive. Bailey Gilbert snaps his 2-fight losing streak to get his first win in the yellow gloves. Great to see. We'll rattle through the remaining 3 fights to talk about because they all ended in the first round. Leon Arms versus Mikhail Falk. Love this fight. Falk stepping in on short notice. 7-6. The most experienced fighter that Leon Arms has faced. A lot of people probably just look at his record and think, cool, this is a setup for Arms. Not really. We saw Mikhail Falk jump in against Chris Price, who was 4-0 at the time and a huge favourite to win, and Falk battered him. Leon Arms 2-0 coming into this has looked really good as a pro, fighting out of MFA with Georgian and Harry Hardwick. Leon Arms, my word, what a performance. Landed the straight right hand all round long, and then eventually lands that right hand again, drops Mikhail Falk, follows up with a few massive shots on the ground. to put the nail in the coffin, just fed him that left hand and then just clobbered him with the right. Leon Arms is the real deal, in my opinion. 3-0 now, 145 pounds. Volk is no mug. Like, it's not easy to go in there and put him out in round one the way Leon Arms did. Arms is dangerous as a grappler, and he's dangerous in that kickboxing range as well. Can't wait to see what they do with him next. I think that 2025 is going to be a huge year for Leon Arms. He set a good foundation for himself in 2024. I think he's standing out now as one of the better prospects in the organization. And yeah, again, to put Mikhail Folk out like that the way he did is someone to keep an eye on for sure. We had James Dixon versus Kendrin Palata. Kendrin Palata scoring the first round submission win to improve to 5-1 and get his first win in the yellow gloves after losing in his debut earlier this year. Has an amateur win over prizefighter winner Emil Brown, so there's some interesting dynamics there, up at 185 pounds. James Dixon made his Cage Warriors debut here, a BKFC fighter, just a tough, hard-nosed guy. To be fair, this fight was fun for as long as it lasted. Both guys swinging for the fence. Palata just showed good timing on his shots, good timing on his head kick. Eventually, Dixon shot for a single leg to take Palata down. Palata escaped, took the back of Dixon, and a lovely neck crank. Not a rear naked choke. I don't think he was under the chin, but that neck crank was nasty. Drew the tap pretty quickly from Dixon, and that's a big win for Kendrin Palata, who I'm sure we'll see again in 2025. And we'll end our breakdown of Cage Warriors 181 with the first fight of the night between Delmar Silva and Michael Chamu. This is Chamu's 9th Cage Warriors fight, riding a 2-fight win streak in 2024, has yet to see a scorecard. Silva steps in on short notice, 6-7, but has won his last 3. This fight lasted as long as you would have expected and ended as you would have expected in terms of the result, but perhaps not the way it would play out. Michael Chamu gets the guillotine choke, his second guillotine choke of 2024, both of them in Newcastle, his only 2 career submission wins, improves to 6-4. What a year for Chamu. You think how it went for him in 2023, losing 3 fights, getting finished in all 3 of those, to jump back in the way he has this year, to win 3 fights in a row, to finish his opponents as well, all in the first round. You love to see it. One of the very nicest guys in the sport, Michael Chamu. What a year for him. And so that wraps up our breakdown of Cage Warriors 181, one of the best cards of the year, 2 amazing title fights at the top of the card, 2 massive prospects in Sean Clancy Jr. and Leon Arms getting the job done. Some amazing performances by way of Justin Burlinson and James Power. Just a pretty unforgettable card for me. I think this one's going to linger and it's going to stay in my mind for quite a while. That was the penultimate fight of the year, which means we are very close to the end of year awards, which is always probably the most exciting thing for me to do every year. We have one more card, which will be in San Diego on the 13th of December. Anthony Orozco, the usual suspects are on that card. Hernandez is in there as well. It's going to be a fun one. Obviously, you guys know how I feel about those San Diego cards. They've got some fun fighters, but sometimes the fights themselves aren't as compelling. But one more card to go, and then we get into those illustrious, prestigious Yellow Glove awards. And I can't wait to get into that. But thank you so much for listening. If you have listened this long, please consider liking the podcast, sharing it, reviewing it, giving it 5 stars. However, which way you can help boost the podcast, just take a minute out of your day and do something nice and help us grow and help us reach a wider audience. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll catch you all Cage Warriors 182 in December.